Hi folks, welcome back. I have your latest market report, market numbers for GTA, for Toronto and Vaughan. My name is Santo Sessa with Remax Premier. Before we get started, please like the video below, subscribe so you're reminded of these, hit the bell button so you're notified each time that one of these videos come up, and we're also producing podcasts, so check out our podcast where we talk more casual about things going on in real estate. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to talk about first freehold properties for Vaughan, then I'm going to talk about Vaughan condos. From there I'm going to go to Toronto freehold and then Toronto condos. And I'm going to do my best to make sense of all these crazy numbers these days. So this report is as of week ending September 27th. I have from March 8th every single week up to September 27th. And if we look at just zero in on the last 2 weeks, we went from a high of 1.3 almost million to 1,224,000. Now, I need to explain this a little bit. These are average sold prices. And when it comes to that, there's some data in average sold prices that helps us to understand, and sometimes it's just not useful. It depends on really what you're looking at. I like using average sold price not to base my decision on exactly what's happening in this one particular week, but more to see the trend. You see, here's the problem with average sold prices. If we say that prices drop from 1 week to the next by, about $120,000, that doesn't mean that your property where you're living right now has a lower value of $120,000. What it basically means is, for week ending September 20th, the composition of homes, these 65 properties that sold, had an average price of $1,346,000. And for the following week, September 27th, 67 properties sold, and their average price was $1,224,000. Now, are we saying that these 67 properties are very similar to the ones that sold the week before? Well, it's hard to say that unless we look in further. And I know that of these 65, there was a particularly high number of properties that sold in the upper price bracket, which brought the average price up. And that's where there's a problem with using average sold price, because you don't know which properties are being sold. However, if you look at it more on a larger scale, more of a trend, well, this is for the Vaughan freehold market. And maybe from week to week, things can change sometimes drastically. Over a certain amount of time, it kind of evens out. Because in this case, we're saying Vaughan properties, well, at some point, you're kind of buying and selling the same properties. So when I look at overall as a trend, and I'm looking here at the beginning of March, this was before we went into a lockdown. Yes, the health crisis was there at the beginning of the year, but it wasn't front and center where we're all locked it down. So here in April, we were locked down, and we saw prices, volume of sales drop right down. And then we started to get more confidence. We've come out of lockdown, and we see prices going up. But if we look at before we went into the lockdown at about $1,220,000, $1,230,000, for a good part of this time over here, for August and September, we're basically very, very similar to where we were before we went into the lockdown. So when I look at this, I take week ending September 20th, and I basically ignore it as an anomaly. It's a crazy once off 1 week. It's a crazy thing that happened. But when I look at the overall average, the overall trend, we're basically sitting where we were before we went into the lockdown. Now, is that good news or bad news? Well, that depends on how you're looking at things. Most people expect real estate prices to go up. For Vaughan, for freehold, I would say they've been pretty steady overall so far. They've not really gone up. So some people might even see that as a loss. That's up to you. But this is how I read this chart. These are real numbers, average sold prices. So what's happening October, November, December? Well, let me tell you what I think is going to happen. Typically, we tend to slow down. So I expect sales to drop. We're leading into the winter months. That normally happens. Plus, I expect average sold prices to come down. And we're heading into a second wave, or we're technically in a second wave now of the health crisis, and that's just going to put added pressure. So I think my opinion would be this trend over these last few months of prices kind of gradually coming down. I expect to see more of that. That's my opinion, what's happening. And I don't do a lot of predictions, but that's kind of what I'm seeing there. Looking at compared to last year, we're pretty much steady as far as where we were last year's prices. And just for that 1 week, week ending 27, we're 10.3% higher when it comes to average sold price than where we were the same time last year. Looking at sales, we've sold a little bit more. Now the orange is for this year, 2020. Blue is for last year. When we look at sales in Vaughan, we are, for many weeks now, we've been selling more than what we've sold last year, but this last week we've come pretty close to where we were on part of last year. But new listings are much higher. So we're selling close to similar, but we're listing more freehold properties right now. And the months of inventory is kind of at 2.5. It's been pretty steady there. And that's it's a seller's market, and it's a very decent seller's market. And price has come down, keeping it to the same months of inventory as it was before. Okay, so Vaughan condos. It's really tough to talk about Vaughan condos just because there's very few sales. But average sold price did drop by quite a bit from 1 week to the next. Looking at the overall trend, except for this 1 week here where we are now, average sold price, if we look at the main over here, has been pretty much similar, a little bit lower I would say, but pretty much similar to where we were before we went into the lockdown. So prices for Vaughan condos has been overall been pretty steady. However, we took a big dip last week. And when we compare it to last year, we teeter-totter between being a little bit more, a little bit less. Sales are consistently lower than where they were last year. Listings consistently higher. And I'm kind of giving the story here of where we expect to see things. Well, months of inventory is finally, we've expected this for a while now, is finally in a balanced market. And that can help explain quite a bit why we have the lower price. And each time we see months of inventory at their highest point, that's when we see prices at their lowest point. Let's get into the city of Toronto. So we're talking about freehold properties here. Looking at sales, sales dropped a little bit from 1 week to the next. Average sold price dropped down by quite a bit. What's that? About $90,000 or so. And similar explanation for what I said in Vaughan. We don't know if these properties sold here, the 376 properties, how similar were they to the 393 properties? But the average gives us 1.4 the previous week and 1.3 this week here for week ending September 27th. But if we step back and kind of see, okay, maybe from one to week, the composition of properties that were sold is different. But it's still the city of Toronto, and over time it should kind of average out. Well, when we look at this, before we went into the lockdown, we were sitting at an average of 1.5. And we were also, at the beginning of March, the end of February, we were doing extremely well. And when we look at the overall average, and we kind of ignore the We were in a lockdown, so very abnormal market. And we look at what's happened afterwards. It's pretty glaringly obvious that average sold price over time for Toronto freehold properties has been trending down. And you can see it here, we're at 1.5. We peaked here in June at 1.5 million also, and it's almost like out of the lockdown, unleashed the hounds, people rushed out, average sold price shot up, sales shot up. We've kind of normalized a bit now, and well, prices have been overall on average trending down. As far as how many properties sold at $2 million or more, we had 44. So not a big difference from the previous week, and in the 40s is kind of where some of our better weeks were. Before we went into the lockdown, that week we had 60 properties that sold over $2 million or more. Let's look at compared to last year. We're slightly higher, 3.6% higher than where we were last year. Now, for most of the year, we've been higher when it comes to Toronto freehold properties, higher when it comes to average sold price compared to last year. But this past week, we're 3.6%. Looking at properties that sold over $2 million, they're pretty much the same. Last year, 43. This year, 44 properties sold over $2 million. That's just for that 1 week, September 27th. Sales. Sales for most of this time now has been higher than last year. However, this past week, we dipped a little bit below where we were the same time last year. Now, this year, we didn't have a spring market. It got pushed to the summer. I imagine there's more of that happening at this time in the fall. Of the 376 properties, though, that were sold last week, 68% were sold at list price or more. So the market is still very active, especially in the freehold market. New listings. So we've sold a little bit less, but we've got much more new freehold properties coming onto the market. More listings than we had last year. That kind of explains, there's more choices. That kind of explains prices trending down in the freehold market. And when we look at months of inventory, it went up a little bit by 0.1%. So we're sitting at 1.6 months of inventory. And average sold price has dropped down a little bit. 1.6 months of inventory is a very healthy, strong market. However, we're selling a little bit less than last year. We can see that there's a lot more listings going out there right now. Prices are starting to trend down. We can see this number coming up in the next little while. That would be my prediction if things stay on the same trend where they are now. And Toronto condos. I know what we're expecting. We've been talking about it for a long, long time. We've been saying that condo owners, especially investment condos, they're getting out of that business and selling their condos. Well, if we look at basically where we were before the lockdown, condos, price-wise, has been really the most steady as far as the peaks and valleys than any other of the home types. Looking at week ending September 27, sales dropped down a little bit. Average sold price dropped down a little bit. But we're basically in line to where we were before the lockdown. But we've had a ton of listings go out. We've had less sales than last year. It's coming to fruition now, really what we've been saying for a long time, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we're basically 11.4% higher than where we were last year's average sold price. And for several weeks now, we've been, averaging around 10% higher than where we were last year. So the prices have been pretty stable there with the Toronto condos. Well, sales way less. We're selling much less than what we sold last year. And 33% of those, so a third sold at list price or more. So there's some action out there when it comes to the right condo. If you're standing out in price or you're standing out in features, people are going to bid for it and give you what you're asking for, assuming it's priced properly. Listings. We have a ton of condo listings. Now when I say ton, compared to what we're used to seeing, so last year, the blue, these are the numbers that we were seeing last year. Almost 600, a little over 600, 600, 538 last week. But we've been 1,100, 1,200 condo listings that have been coming out, so double than what was being listed last year. So going back to the previous slide, we're buying less, we're listing double. Months of inventory at some point has no choice but to go up. There's a lot more choices out there, and that's pushing the average sold price down. And my prediction for the next few months, we're going to see more of that. There's just a lot of condos coming onto the market these days. Look, that's our market report for this week. There's a lot going on. It's so important that you have a strong realtor in your corner helping you navigate. This is a guide. You shouldn't base all your decisions on what's going on here on a week-to-week basis. Look at the trend to get a feel and understanding for the market. But if you're looking to sell, I'll give you an example. If you invite me to your house and say, I'm looking to sell, I'm going to have a look at your house. I'm going to look at what's sold nearby. I'm going to kind of understand the trend of which way we're going, and that's going to help me to price your home. But the most important numbers are what's happening in your neighborhood right now and in which direction our price is going. My name is Santo Sessa with RE/MAX Premier. Stay safe. Talk to you in a week.